good evening and welcome to a very special King's Arms Catching Up With event, where this evening we're delighted to have you join us as we discuss COVID, vaccination, conspiracies, and how we as Christians should be responding to each of those things. Now, I have a confession to make right at the start of this evening. A full disclosure, I am not a biology scientist, I'm not an epidemiologist, but like most of you, I am a pursuer of truth. And as best as I can, what we're going to be doing is walking through some of the questions that we've had people pose in advance to us this evening. Now, all that said, when we're having evenings like this, I do want to invite you to join in the conversation. And so whether you're watching live right now on Facebook or on our YouTube channel, any comments that you share will be visible. So I'm going to try as best I can to include those as we go through the course of this evening. However, what I do want to stress, especially on an evening like this, is that we would love for you to join with us in modeling honor and respect and grace in those comments that you do post, recognizing that there might be a breadth of opinions on some of the things that we're going to be talking about this evening, okay? Because we recognize that we do live in a world where there is great diversity of opinion, and it really is our desire to create a platform this evening for conversation, which we hope will really inform you and help you to make good decisions for both yourself as well as your family, as we hear direct from people who I would call this evening as trusted friends of the church, okay? Now, importantly, what I do want to stress is that as we share tonight, these are the considered opinions of our friends and our panel, but whilst they come with relevant professional expertise and experiences, they do also come just as friends, so not in their professional capacities, okay? So listen, as we start the evening, I'm going to introduce Simon, who's what I'd love for Simon to do. Here he comes in, look. Simon, great to have you this evening.
Great to be with you, Steve.
Now, listen, what I wanted to do, mate, but first, before we introduce the panel tonight, is just to ask you, if you like, is why this evening came about, why you felt like it was important for us as we get started.
Yeah, I think we, when we were talking about this as a team, Steve, we just really felt that it was just important to open the conversation on some of these issues that have been kind of swirling around on social media and in conversations with people for quite some time now. And felt we'd actually hoped to do it earlier, hadn't we? But we couldn't get people's diaries together. But felt it's just really important for us to be diving in. And we've obviously created this part. One of the benefits of this whole lockdown period is creating these catching up with places where we can talk about. There's only so many Sundays. There's only so many things you can do on a Sunday, and actually some conversations aren't even appropriate for a Sunday. Really, that actually they're much better done in a longer form. And in a way that those who are interested in can engage with, and those that aren't, okay, that's fine, So I think we wanted to create this platform where we can talk about some of these issues, and if this felt like a pertinent one, particularly in this seasons of vaccine rollouts and government policies and all sorts of things going on, we thought it's really important. So yeah, really grateful to be here and grateful that we got some great friends along for the ride tonight to be able to engage and help us on this conversation.
Absolutely. Now, if you are one of the people who's already tuning in, it'd be great if you just say hello. And if there's anything particularly that you find encouraging tonight, do feel free to let us know in the chat as well. So listen, let me introduce our three guests for this evening who are going to form part of the panel to kind of share some of their responses to some of the questions that have been posed. First, we've got Ben Enejo, who has a degree in molecular medicine and works with a major biopharmaceutical company and has a keen interest in new medicine and new medicine development. We've got the amazing Rachel Hickman, who's a social worker, but particularly comes to us this evening because of her degree in theology and really enjoys looking at a theological framework from the Bible and how it should underpin our worldview and the decisions that we make every day. And we're also thrilled to have Enson Thomas with us, who's an elder at Woodside Church, but is also a consultant respiratory physician and the clinical lead for Respiratory Services and the COVID response at Bedford Hospital. And listen, as I introduce you guys, oh, forgive me, I just kicked myself out of the screen.
We suddenly got nervous because we lost you, Steve. We're like, we didn't realize he was going to leave us on our own to do this.
That's it, done. I do say is I'm very cool. the fact that we have Christians in these sorts of places of responsibility in our town who are just serving and loving people really well. And so thank you so much for your ability to kind of come along this evening. We're so glad to have you with us. And so we really appreciate each of your kind of time on a Friday night. So thank you very much for that. Now, listen, to start the conversation, what I really wanted to do is come to Enson first, okay? And Enson, it goes in one respect without saying, but I really do want to say on behalf of the King's Arms, because of your role where you've been serving your socks off over the last year, and I'm sure for many months and years prior to that, we are so very grateful, honored indeed, for the fact that you're serving our town in the way that you do. And so on behalf of the church, I do indeed want to thank you for the way that you're kind of loving people in kind of serving at the hospital in your role of overseeing the kind of COVID response there. But mate, I do want to come to you first to, I guess, ask a question that for a long time people have been wondering, is COVID really as bad as people have been saying? And obviously there will be some people who are thinking, is it that it's particularly the elderly or the very poorly, who are getting ill and having serious consequences?
Thanks, Steve. So yes, COVID has produced a large number of deaths not only in this country but the world over. And in this country, I mean, if you can Google it, and get the ONS data, you'll find that until the 1st of January, there has been about 20% excess deaths compared to the previous years. So if you look at the data, I mean, you can get a month-by-month breakdown of the deaths over the last several years, going back to quite a long time. And you can then compare it with the last year, and you can certainly see there is certainly an excess number of deaths, and that is true. And it's not just the elderly and people with chronic conditions, like we call it comorbidities, people with heart conditions and diabetes and other things. It's not just them that get COVID and die from COVID. Particularly during this most recent second wave, we have seen a large number of younger people coming into hospitals. So if you had visited our respiratory ward, Pilgrim ward, you would have seen people in their 40s and 50s, people both, white Caucasians, people Asian background, Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, people from every background coming into hospital, young people, 40s and 50s, with severe illness, severe pneumonia, on a lot of oxygen, being ventilated, and some people getting tubed and mechanically ventilated on ITU as well. And there has been deaths in this category of patients as well. So younger patients are dying and are getting severe illnesses from COVID.
Enson, just jump in, and how bad has it been this winter? I mean, you've worked in the hospital for many years. Is it the worst year you've ever seen? Is it just been horrendous? How bad has it been?
It's been horrendous, in the hospital, and throughout on every ward in the hospital, we have seen a large number of deaths, and so much so that our doctors and nurses, it's affected them, mentally as well, and we had to bring in clinical psychologists to help them and support them, while they were dealing with, such a crisis, on such a large scale. It's something that we have never experienced, and so many of our colleagues have had COVID, and I personally have treated a large number of doctors and nurses, who suffered with COVID, and thankfully we haven't lost anyone here, and so by the grace of God, we haven't lost anyone here. But it's been horrendous. It's been horrendous, particularly on our ward, where at one time we were ventilating about 16 or 17 patients, on our ward. We've seen a large number of deaths, and so it has been horrendous year.
Oh, so sad to hear, Enson. And I think just, as Steve said, our thanks again to the team and all that you've been doing to keep people alive. And what would you say, Enson, to some of us will have seen videos of people going into hospitals saying, hey, look, this hospital's empty. It's not as bad as the NHS is making out. This kind of would be on the more kind of very skeptical end. What would you say to those people who are doing that? How would your response be to that, having lived through the last winter?
That's a completely wrong statement. I don't know where they get those, that sort of opinion or observation from, because certainly we have been struggling for beds in the hospital, and at one point we reached the maximum amount of oxygen we could deliver in the hospital, and so we were oxygen critical at several points during this winter, and also during the first wave as well. And there have been times when we've had to shift the patient from here to other hospitals because we were oxygen critical in the hospital. So the beds were not available. Oxygen was, very critical. Oxygen supply was critical because there is a certain amount of oxygen that we can use at any one point. I think we can use up to about 1,300 liters per minute. And so we came very close to, exceeding that limit, on several occasions. And so it's been, managed very tightly during this winter. Yeah.
Wow. And just to link. Oh, sorry, Steve.
Well, no, I was just going to ask Enson. Right now, we've got 75 people watching across various different channels, and just wanted to ask Enson whether there was any particular prayer points you would give us at this point for Christians who want to keep praying for the hospital.
So, I mean, yes, we should pray that first of all, the vaccination would be effective, and it will certainly prevent severe COVID infection. We don't think it will prevent COVID infection, but we are hoping that it will reduce the severity of infection to the need for people to come into hospital. Because if it is when they come into hospital and they need large amounts of oxygen and ventilation, that is when we see the excess number of deaths and the morbidity that takes place as a result of that. So we should certainly pray for the vaccine to be effective. Secondly, we need to pray for the staff at the hospital,
Yes.
because many of them have suffered so much. They have given, so much. I know personally, they have suffered so much and they've given so much. And I don't think anyone should underestimate, the severity of the infection, or the size of the infection. And because people have put their lives on the line, to serve the community at large, not only in this town, but throughout the nation and the nations of this world. And so we need to pray for these doctors and nurses and all the other people, physiotherapists and all the other people, who have been serving on the front line, for them to have some peace and comfort, because they have suffered so much. They have suffered from seeing so much death, firsthand, because, this has never been witnessed, at least in their lifetime, so much death, And so if we can pray for them to have some peace and comfort and some healing, that would be very, very helpful.
Thank you, Enson.
Really good. Thanks so much, Enson. Simon, was there something else we're going to ask Enson now, or shall I move on to our next questions?
No, that's fine. I think move us on, Steve. That was great. I think Enson covered
Fantastic. Enson, so helpful. And no doubt we'll be coming back to you at different points. And just to say, it's great to have people chipping in with comments already. And Nicolette, as a student nurse who's on the front line, we so appreciate you. But Ben, I've put you in centre stage, my friend, with your very squeaky chair. But we're really grateful to have you. And we were going to sort of go down a trajectory.
I should try to sit still.
No problem at all, my friend.
You look like a naughty schoolboy now, Ben. You're like you've been told off by the
know. In front of 75 people as well, right?
Listen, I wanted to ask you, Ben, a little bit about vaccines. Obviously, that is your background, that is your world that you're working in right now. And before we dive into some of the detail, which I'll bring other people into as well, I wondered for someone like me who doesn't know a huge amount about some of the kind of biology and background, would you be able to just describe for us a little bit about how vaccines work? Would that be possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks, Steve. Really good to be here this evening. I think the simplistic way of describing a vaccine would be a substance you inject or you put into a human or an animal in order to generate antibodies that would help that person fight the real disease, right? So you would often use a substance which could be a weakened virus or a part of a virus that or a dead virus, and that is normally inoculated. And injected into someone. And I think most of us listening on this call should have had some form of vaccine in our childhood at some point, right? And so the way it works is that the substance use would interact with the human cell, with the host cells, and generate a whole lot of molecular reactions, activating the cells that help keep us healthy, the T cells, and all the B cells that get proliferated, and then you get the generation of antibodies that I guess go around your body system looking to find the disease. And so when you come in contact with the real disease, the body would have trained itself, would have got enough immunity and antibodies to then fight the disease. Now, the way vaccines work is that they start off this reaction, but the body gets to learn, the body has a complex, nice, something we should be grateful for, memory cells that, means that once you've had an exposure to a vaccine, the body remembers it and starts off the generation of those T cells and antibodies to help fight it when you eventually get it, right? So that's at a high level how what vaccines are and what they do.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Ben. I really appreciate the big picture for us. And obviously what we want to do is dive into the detail of some of this. And so some of these topics are going to be meaty, some of them are going to be delicate. And but I really wanted to sort of jump into one of the main things that I've heard about the vaccine. And that is that the vaccine is made from aborted babies or cell lines from aborted fetuses. And so if I could come to you first with some of the detail, Ben, and then what I might do is try and bring in Simon for some of the kind of Christian ethics and so on that we can wrestle with at this point as well.
Yeah, and Steve, that's a point that has been debated a lot. A lot of false information has gone out, unfortunately. It's a big topic, and I'm glad you raised that. I'm glad we're talking about that this evening. I think before I even answer that question, I think there are two things to be aware of. The first one is the strong ethical regulations we have here in the West or in Western countries. And, over here in the UK, as an example, we have some of the highest ethical standards. Like you said, Steve, I do work in the pharmaceutical sector, and I can inform you that, before the pharmaceutical researchers carry out any form of research, they have to go through a stringent review and approval process, right? So before you're allowed to put any new drug in a human, there's a whole lot of checks which has and the companies would need to go through. And part of that is the ethics committee review and approval. So there's a strong ethical element to that. And I'll come back to why I said this in a minute. The other point to state as well is the information flying around that they're using aborted babies and cell lines in the current COVID vaccine. I think you would need to check your sources, right? I would generally recommend people to look up legitimate sources of information. But I think everything we've heard and seen so far shows that from an ethical perspective, the UK government, and most countries, I would say, would not be approving for the use of aborted babies for any form of research, right? And secondly, when it comes to the cell line everyone keeps talking about, actually, if you do take those from aborted babies, they wouldn't be appropriate. They wouldn't be suitable for use for the form of research that it's being used for. And so I think what people often refer to is the human embryonic kidney cell line, which is called the HEK cell line 293, which are cell lines that go back to the 70s. I think it was somewhere in the Netherlands where, an ethically aborted fetus, a scientist was able to get hold of their cell line, and it was subsequently cloned and has been I guess mass produced over the years and been used for research. So we're not talking about something that's happened in the last few years due to COVID. The HEK cell lines have been used. They work as factories to help produce viral proteins that can be used in drug development or in medical research. And so those cell lines have been propagated for such a long time, over so many years, and have been used for a number of vaccines in the past. So when people hear this and they immediately think it's the vaccines, I mean, this current set of vaccines which we're aware of using human currently aborted fetal cell lines, I think that would firstly not get approval. Secondly, that is not what we heard from the pharmaceutical companies. If for anything, they're using, for those using the cell lines, they're using the HEK 293 cell lines. And to even give you a bit of history on this, and I'll shut up in a minute, Steve, just to give you a bit more history on this, when the cell lines, as we understand it from school days of when I was back in university, not that long ago, was that when the cell lines were harvested, they couldn't be used straight away. They were cloned, and they had all sorts of manipulation done. I think there were up to 293 attempts at this to make the cell lines to be stable enough to use as these factories for producing viral proteins. And so it's not, and these things take months, so it's not something you can do today and pick it up today to use for a vaccine and have that ready straight away. So I think there's a lot of misinformation going on that front, but I think I would say to people, just look up to the source of the information and where you're getting this information, and make sure it's a reliable source you're feeding information from.
Really helpful. Thanks, Ben. Simon, I wonder if I could bring... No, it really does help. It's a really, really good background to some of the kind of biology behind it. Simon, I wonder if I can bring you in, though, and just ask you to share a little bit as a church leader and someone who would have wrestled with the ethics of this, based on some of the things that Ben, has just said, and share some of your thoughts on how we should appropriate this as Christians.
Yeah, I think this is a complex one ethically for Christians, and I really do respect people having different opinions on this. I think it's not completely straightforward, I would say. I think Ben's, from the research I've done, obviously Ben will be more experienced than I am. That's absolutely, what he's saying is absolutely right, that this was, and just adding a little bit, the fetus wasn't aborted for the sake of the for the sake of the production. The two coincided, but one wasn't done for the other, if that makes sense, which perhaps helps a little bit. I think why personally I would value all life, even that of the unborn, and obviously this is the complex. We haven't got time tonight to go into the issues of abortion, but would that for me there's huge ethical issues around abortion for us as believers. It's a really important issue for us to wrestle with, and I can understand some people having concerns. I think as I've delved into it, one of the issues you have to also understand is that loads of modern vaccines are developed using these cell lines. So it's not just a COVID thing. Rubella, smallpox, lots of the hepatitis A, lots. And to be honest, I wasn't aware of that. I wasn't aware that they all use this HEK 293 cell line, as Ben said, because it is so stable and has been able to be cloned over many, many years. So I think that the extreme version of this is people are saying, oh no, every vial has got aborted baby, fetus cells in it. That's clearly not the case. That is not the case at all, and far from it. Were the original cell lines that have been used in the production and development of some of the vaccines. Obviously, some of them have used the cell lines in the production and the development, and some of them have used it in the production. So I think the Johnson & Johnson one, which is the new one that's come through, has been used in the production of the vaccine as well. And I think, I would recognize that some Christians would have ethical issues with that, and some would feel they wouldn't have ethical issues because of the history of it, as Ben described. And I think there is a matter and a freedom of conscience there for people to work out. Living in a fallen world, we all have a degree of proximity to evil that is probably closer than we would like. So how many of us, for example, have inheritances that generations ago were accrued through evil activities? Some of us don't even know. How many of us have walked on streets that have been paid for by immoral activities? There's a proximity to evil that is around us that we have to be aware of and understand. We're living in a fallen world. Now, does that mean to say that we can commit evil acts ourselves. Now, of course, we can't, and so that there is a line here, and I think there's a wrestle here. I love 1 Corinthians 8, where Paul's talking about some of these controversial issues in his day about meat sacrificed to idols, and he says, while knowledge makes us feel important, it's love that strengthens the church. Anyone who claims to know all the answers doesn't really know very much, but the person who loves God is the one that God recognizes. So I think it's recognizing that sometimes there is room for ethical discussion around some of these things, and for people to go according to their conscience. I personally wouldn't have a problem going with the vaccine because of knowing all of that. I still wouldn't have a problem. I feel like it is appropriate. I think were there active abortion of fetuses for the development of future vaccines, I would have a problem with that and would want to speak out against that. But as far as I understand, that isn't something that's actively happening. These are historical things. And in one sense, there is also a redemptive element. That child that was aborted actually is ultimately going to save many, many lives. And so there is a redemptive element. I know some would feel happy with that, some wouldn't. So my main thing is that as Christians, we need to ethically think these things through. As Ben says, check the sources, but then also engage in love and respect for one another where there is disagreement on some of these issues. So yeah, I don't know if Rachel wants to chip in on this as well. This is a thorny one theologically, Rachel, isn't it?
I think for me, as someone who's not a medical professional and doesn't understand necessarily some of the science behind it, I've found John Wyatt a really great resource. He's a doctor and a research scientist in the UK and a Christian. And he places the kind of ethical dilemma in the context of kind of the ethics of also not taking the vaccine, which I found a really interesting way of thinking about it, in terms of actually that we also have an ethical drive in terms of protecting the vulnerable and kind of responsibility for those in our community who are vulnerable to COVID, and so that there's an ethical dimension either way, and that doesn't make it straightforward. And I think it's absolutely an issue of conscience, but personally, it's something I've grappled with, and I am having the vaccine on Monday, and I think for me, some of John Wyatt's resources have been really helpful in grappling with that ethical dilemma.
Really helpful. So that's John Wyatt, if people want to go and have a read of some of their materials, is it, Rachel?
Yeah, John Wyatt. He's got some articles and a podcast that I found really useful.
Yeah, really
fantastic.
Helpful.
I do have other questions on the vaccine, but Enson, just wanted to, on the ethical side of it, didn't know whether you wanted to chip in anything there, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, I can just reiterate, everything that has been said. People need to understand that, I just reiterate that the embryonic cell, the fetal cells that were taken from a legally aborted fetus back in the 1970s. And these cells have been immortalized, so we have a continuous supply of cells coming in. So we don't need to abort babies or anything. We don't need aborted fetuses now in the future for any studies. And looking at it, just imagine we have this continuous cell supply, so we don't have to use animals. We don't have to use, any other, go to any other, any other resource to produce any of these vaccines. And, with the development of these vaccines, we are actually helping to save lives. We are helping to, reduce, morbidity and everything. So that is what we have to bear in mind. The fetus was aborted legally, ethically, in the 70s, but that tissue is now being used to save lives and to reduce morbidity and suffering. And that is how we need to look at it. So I have no issues with that. And, I've had my vaccine and I'm going for my second dose end of this month. So
thank you. So appreciate each of you sharing. But I'm going to come back
chipping in on that one as well, Steve. Just lastly, I think as well, what some have questioned, obviously we've allowed the vaccine, and the King's House has become a centre for the distribution of vaccine, and we wrestled through this as a team, as elders. We and the SL strategic leadership team, we wrestled this through, and I think again, based on everything we've said, that we came down on the balance of actually for the sake of the society, for the serving of the community, that we felt it was right to do this, because there is an ethical line here, but actually on the balance of all these things, we felt that it was the right call to allow the vaccine for the protection of lives and to alleviate the suffering that's going on because of COVID. And so that was why we came down on that. But I totally respect others who wouldn't take the vaccine for that. That's, you know, and would love and respect people who come to a different opinion as well. And I think that's the main thing, is there is such a divisive spirit in operation on the earth at the moment. And I think one of the things I would appeal to people is a sense of unity and respect and honor, and recognizing that these are not straightforward questions. There's complexity to them that requires us to, you know, do what 1 Corinthians 8 verse 1 says. I think it's important for us to understand that. I think Enson wants to comment on that.
I mean, I think people are being thrown into confusion unnecessarily, because if we have a concern with the COVID vaccine, then we should have concern for all the vaccines that we give. We administer vaccines to our children, you know. So if we have a concern, then we should have a concern for that as well. I mean, we've been vaccinating children for a long time, for decades, and we don't have a concern. So why suddenly we need to have a concern? I think that is, you know, people are being thrown into confusion unnecessarily. You know, it's the same mechanism, it's the same sort of methodology and everything. So there should be no room for concern or confusion, I would say.
Fantastic. Thanks, Enson. I want to stick with vaccines for a moment, just as we answer this next question. And Ben, I'm going to come to you as someone who kind of obviously works in that world. And this is the question that lots of people have had about: has the creation of this vaccine been rushed? And therefore, does it have the potential to be unsafe? And then as something that's connected it to it, you know, asking questions about whether the government is trying to earn money from vaccine companies and pharmaceutical companies and so on. So I wonder whether you would just be able to speak into that for a moment.
Yeah, I think that's also another relevant question, Steve. Has the process been accelerated? Yes, we have never seen a vaccine developed at this pace, as far as we can remember. So has it gone a lot faster? Yes, it has. But I think a couple of things we need to be aware of in terms of what's helping the acceleration, in my opinion. Two things come to mind. The first one is the technologies we have right now, which in the past we've not had. Going back to university days again, I remember when we used to talk about, you know, perhaps the use of mRNA-based treatment and how that this could all work. And we know science is constantly evolving, and, you know, back then it was just a concept, but right now we live in the reality of that concept. And I think technology has enabled us to do some of that today. So has it been accelerated? Yes, technology has helped us with that. I think another reason why we've seen some acceleration is it's just the focus that has gone into it, right? Most people who work in this industry know it costs millions, if not billions, to bring a new vaccine, a new drug into the market, right? But and getting funding for this does take time. Also, clinical trials is also a key part of the new drug discovery or vaccine discovery. So they have to be tried out in animal models and tried out in the first phase in healthy human beings, a small sample of patients. And then if the drug is seen to be you know, effective, if they look out for this, for the safety and the efficacy. And if the result is great, then you move to a bigger sample of patients before you try that out, right? And all through the process, you are feeding into the regulators, by the way. So you can't just go do this in the corner somewhere and come back. You have to be in constant communication with the authorities. And so you then try it at the third phase before you get some kind of approval. You know, in that case, you need thousands of patients or people or humans to have tried the drug and to see if it's effective or the efficacy and the safety before the drug gets given approval. What we have seen in the last year, Steve, is just, I'm astounded by this, the number of people willing to participate in these clinical trials to help us to get an answer. For someone who has been doing this work in this space for a while, I can tell you that getting patients into or subjects into a clinical trial is one of the most challenging part of drug discovery and new drug discovery or vaccine discovery. And what we've seen here, because of the current situation, is we've had a lot more participants queuing up to participate in this. And so that gives you the sample size you need to do the analysis. This would normally have taken months and months and years to get the same number of people. So I think there's been an emphasis on the technology, but also the resources and focus that has been given globally to help get an answer, I think has led to some of the acceleration. But then, everyone is right to think, what are the risks associated with this? If something normally takes 5-10 years and it's done in 1 year, should I not be worried? And I think if anyone that was in my sector say any drug is 100% safe, I think they would be immediately disqualified from operating in this industry. What we know about drug approval, in this case, the vaccine approval, which hasn't been approved, actually has been given emergency use authorization. What we do know about it is that it will be monitored in the long term, and I can tell you drugs that were approved and vaccines that were approved 10, 15 years ago are still being monitored, right? Back in my, a few years ago, I worked for AstraZeneca, actually, and I was in the patient safety and drug safety department, and that was one of the things we watched out for, the long-term efficacy of a drug, the long-term safety profile of a drug. So that's while this has been accelerated, the review process has been robust, and we know it's gone out to over 20 million people in the UK. It's gone out even more globally, and so these things will continue to be monitored. If the regulators felt it wasn't safe or effective, it would not have been given the emergency use. And trust me, the UK regulator is incredibly comprehensive when it comes to review of new drugs. So has it been accelerated? Yes. Do we have cause for concern? I would say no. The same standards have been applied, and we have to keep an eye on it in the long term to see what it is, having had it for years and years. And I think your second question, Steve, is the government doing this to raise money, or pharmaceutical companies doing this to cash in on a situation like this? And my response to that is a bit like Enson, who's on the front line, on the medical front, seeing nurses and doctors and so many medical staff give their life and everything they could to try to keep patients safe. In this industry, we also see the same thing where scientists are working through the night, working, from the testing side of things to the research process. People are giving so much of their time to try to find a solution, right? So I know no industry is perfect. I know no industry is without its blame. But what I see from the inside is the genuine passion for in the pharmaceutical sector to find solutions to help us all in the middle of this pandemic.
Enson, you're going to come in at that point, my friend.
Yeah. I think, I would like to just add, to what Ben has said. So basically, asking the question, was it rushed? Yes, it was rushed. And the reason it was rushed was to save lives and to reduce morbidity. We have lost a lot of, lives in this country because of COVID and the world. And so the governments have to come up with something that will, reduce the severity of illness and reduce deaths. So that is number one. The second thing to bear in mind is, people are concerned about injecting, the vaccine into the body. So basically, we are injecting part of the viral mRNA, viral material into the body. Now, just imagine, when you get the actual COVID infection, you're getting the full dose. You're getting the actual virus going to you, the full mRNA coming to your body. So instead of the actual viral mRNA coming to your body, you're using part of the mRNA, injecting into the body to create what we call a spike protein, to produce a viral protein. And we expect the body to mount an immune response against this spike protein. so that when the actual virus comes in, the immune system can then, prevent, the virus from getting a foothold in the body. So what you have to bear in mind is we are only injecting a part of the viral genetic material, whereas when you get the actual viral infection, you're getting the full genetic material into your body and lots of it. So we need to think, in those sort of terms, and then we'll understand what we are doing is nothing harmful at all.
Really helpful. Thank you, Enson. And I do hope that this is being helpful for people, and I'll try and weave in some people's questions as we go forward. I want to take a slightly different tack for a minute, guys, and just talk a little bit for us. And I'm going to come to Rachel and to Simon if possible, because obviously in the midst of everything that's been happening in the last year, but frankly, over the last few years, when it comes to the kind of separation of people, the diversity of opinion, but particularly around conspiracy theories, what I'm interested in is how do Christians respond to those kind of things? How do we, someone even asked it earlier, how do we find truth, in the midst of these things, in the midst of a world of fake news and headlines and clickbait and so on? What does it look like for us to really pursue where we get our healthy information from? So I don't know, Simon, Rachel, which of you would like to go first in the midst of this?
Rachel, after you, if you'd like to go first.
I think the first thing that I wanted to say on this is that I think it's really understandable that people have fear and anxiety and this confusion about what's true and what's not true, and there's worry about that. And in that, I think it makes sense that people are looking for kind of a narrative or a story that brings meaning to it, or that in somehow makes it more understandable. That's really understandable that people are in that place kind of looking for meaning. I think for us as Christians, we have a big story. We have God's narrative of salvation that we I think sometimes when there's fear, that actually we need to go back to the basics of the gospel, that actually that's where we find our peace and our security, that we know the end of the story. Our security is in Him, that we don't have to come from a place of fear. I think then the next thing is just having wisdom in where we're looking for information and checking our sources and going to reputable sources, and going to sources where the information can be authenticated and fact checked, and that we're looking for transparency. And I think if something's murky or we can't quite figure out where the information's coming from, that we should be cautious on that. And that I think that there is information out there that is transparent, that we can find the numbers, and go from those sources that are reputable. And then I think the third thing in my mind in terms of bringing those things together is then getting with the Holy Spirit and searching for wisdom. He's the one that guides us into truth. And we've already said that some of these things are kind of conscience issues, and we might all kind of land in different places. But that He's the one that gives us wisdom when we ask, and He's the one that leads us into truth. And that when we're rooted in a place of peace and kind of the security of our salvation, we're not coming from a place of fear, and actually fact checking our sources, that we can then kind of wrestle it through with Holy Spirit, hopefully to come to a place of peace. And that's not always easy, and it's sometimes a process and it can take time, but I think these things aren't things where we can tell people what to believe or where they should or shouldn't land on them. It is an issue of conscience, I think, of finding our peace, but not coming at it from a place of fear.
Very good, thank you. Simon, let me bring you in.
I think the headline theologically, I think there is a conspiracy, and it's way worse than anyone thinks. That's actually what the Bible says. Ephesians 6, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but the rulers of the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. So when I think about conspiracy, I think, there is a conspiracy, and it's way worse than any of us think it is. And it's a spiritual conspiracy, actually. Psalm 2, why do the nations conspire? The peoples plot in vain. the kings of the earth ride up, the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let's break off their chains, let's throw off their shackles. So in the biggest picture of the sense of conspiracies, we're all part of a conspiracy. It's a rebellion against God. And I think it's really important to understand that there is a spiritual war going on in the heavenly places for the hearts and minds of mankind. And people might say, well, Simon, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the conspiracy of Bill Gates putting microchips in us through a vaccine. But actually, when you think about it, if you go back to that Ephesians passage, Paul tells us how to handle conspiracy, that big conspiracy, the conspiracy of all conspiracies, which is against God. He tells us how to handle it. And he says, look, first off, you've got to stand firm against it. You've got to stand firm against the wiles of the enemy. And he says, well, how do you stand firm then? Is it by sharing loads of stuff on the internet through Twitter and whatever? No, what he says is put on the belt of truth, because in an age of conspiracy, in an age where truth is out there, there is some truth that we know is true. There's lots of things we don't know whether they're true or not, but there's some things we do know is true, which is the gospel. That is the belt of truth. We come back to scripture. And so instead of sharing loads of stuff that we've seen here, there, and the other, as Rachel said, we don't know the source of it. We know the source of the Bible. It's from God. So share that stuff. Share the things that are true, that we know are true. Put on that belt of truth. And then Paul says, stand with the armor of righteousness, And I think recognizing that the body armor of God's righteousness, it means in times of conspiracy, confusion, we seek to live right, which is to live with kindness, which is to live with holiness, which is to live with love for people, which is to love. So we share that stuff and we live from that place rather than spreading fear, spreading confusion. We seek to stand in a place of righteousness because, when we're aware of the spiritual battle, then even more so we stand on those things. And then I think the other thing he says is that we pray in the Spirit on all occasions. And I think, to me, if all the Christians on the planet spent less time researching conspiracies and more time praying in the Spirit, we would be in a lot better place than endlessly. I mean, Jesus said, didn't he? Don't worry about tomorrow. Today has got enough problems. And I think a lot of this stuff wants to send us into fear of tomorrow, when actually we should be just praying in the Spirit and saying, God, let the truth come out. Let the truth. There's not me spending hours and hours researching. It's actually not helping anyone. Me praying in the Spirit, saying, God, we believe that every conspiracy one day is going to be brought down and anything is going to be silenced when you, Jesus, reign. And I think living from that place, as Rachel said, we come against the fear. And lots of these things, I think, say, they say, well, the government's trying to spew fear. Well, to me, the conspiracy theorists are often trying to spew as much fear as both sides. If you take it that way, as everyone's trying to use fear, and ultimately we're not motivated by fear. We're motivated by love. And so, looking, as Rachel said, by the Spirit, where do we find our peace? Follow the road of peace. Follow the place that leads to love. Follow the place that leads to kindness to one another. I think is critical in these days to stand firm against whatever's going on. And to be honest, many of us don't know the big picture. We don't understand. And anyone who says that they do is, as it says in 1 Corinthians 8, doesn't, And I think that, the ability for anyone to share now from their laptop with no corroboration, with no backup is just there's never been a time in history like it. And so it's so critical, I think, as Rachel said, to check our sources, to discuss together, to follow the peace of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, so those would be a few things I think about the whole conspiracy thing.
Really helpful. I mean, just in terms of end times theology and so on, one specific question we had was over this kind of, could it be the mark of the beast that's referenced in Revelation? I didn't know whether either you would be willing to kind of reference that.
Yeah, I mean, Rachel, I'm sure would love to comment on this. I think if you look, the mark of the beast is mentioned a number of times in Revelation. I know lots of people are concerned about it. The link between the mark, I mean, firstly, we haven't got time to go into the big picture of how you read Revelation. There's obviously different ways to read it, but whichever way you read it, the mark of the beast is linked to a worship of something that is not God, and so it's given to those who are worshippers of those of the Antichrist or the dragon that's listed in Revelation. And so I don't think you would unknowingly take the mark of the beast, if you put it that way. I don't think you'll, however you read Revelation, there's lots of different ways you could read it, but however you read it, I don't think the mark of the beast, and obviously many would read it as, Revelation, the mark of the beast 666 is actually, it's the Hebrew Nero Caesar is 666, and so it's a number linked to a name, which they love to do in the kind of Jewish culture. We don't really do it, but they love to do it, and so that's where the root of it is. Many would say this is fulfilled in Caesar. Caesar is the archetypal one that was pointed to the mark of the beast, and actually, but even if you read it as this is a future thing that's about to happen, I think it's not something that you would unwittingly take or be involved with. It would be something very much for those who are set up against the worship of God. And so as Christians, I don't have any fear that you'll be able to take the mark of the beast without realizing that you're walking away from the Lord and you're walking away from him. But Rachel's probably got a far better answer than I have on that one.
Rachel, I don't know whether there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Simon said, and I think, I think Revelation can be such an intimidating book to get into because the language uses a lot of imagery and allegory, and I think, but actually, it's essentially, it says in, right at the beginning, it's a revelation of Jesus Christ, that it's essentially to give us a clearer vision of Jesus. And as Simon said before, we are in a battle, that there is a battle, it does play out a battle, but that essentially the Lamb is on the throne, and we know that he's victorious. I think in terms of, the mark of the beast, I think, as Simon's saying, it's a mark of worship and devotion of the beast. And that's in contrast in Revelation 14 to those who are sealed by the Lamb, as those who are followers of Jesus. And I think, for me, there's a real link there in 2 Corinthians, that we are sealed by the Spirit, that we have the Spirit as a guarantee of our salvation and our inheritance. And I think, as Simon said, I don't think we need to fear that if we are worshippers of Jesus, that we could accidentally get the mark of the beast. It's about a devotion to something other than Jesus. And I think we have to be careful, however much we disagree with a government policy or a law, that we don't conflate that with a biblical text and take it out of context. And I think, as Simon referenced as well, I think some of the imagery that's used actually would have been understood within the cultural context of the day. And that kind of, we don't have time to go into all of that now, but when you go into some of it, actually, it would have been understood in terms of the Roman Empire and the superpower that was in place at that time. And once you unpick some of that, I think it's just a lot less intimidating as a book.
I'm so grateful for you guys.
Just to chip in on that as well, Steve, right? A brilliant answer, Rachel. But just to chip in as well, if you read Revelation and come away fearing the beast and the devil, you've read it all wrong, because Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. That's how it starts. So unless you come away worshiping Jesus, thinking he wins and the church overcomes, that is the message of Revelation. Jesus wins, the church overcomes. That's the point. So if you walk away from any part of Revelation fearing the beast and the devil or what's going to happen, as a believer, you've read it all wrong. It's just, that's not the point of it. John says right at the beginning, this is the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so I think anytime we read scripture and come away with an unhealthy fear of the enemy, an unhealthy fear of what might happen to us, we've missed the point. We've got to reread it, because as Jesus said, all scripture points to me. All scripture is pointing to how great he is, how much he's overcome, the victory of the cross, and it should all lead to that place. And whenever I sense that kind of fear rising in my spirit, I think, well, hang on a minute, there's something gone wrong. Something gone wrong here. This can't be how it was meant to be understood. I must have misunderstood it.
Yeah, Simon, that's so helpful. And normally at that point, I would say yes, amen, and close the meeting, because it would be such a brilliant time to stop the conversation. However, there are a number of things that I'd still love us to cover if we're able to. And I know it's taking slightly kind of longer than perhaps we'd hoped, but we really want to do this in a really thorough way. But Ben, I'm actually going to come to you for a question, if you're happy for me to, because one of the things that lots of my kind of BAME, kind of friends have been asking about is actually pointing back to some very, very valid questions and hesitations because of historical injustices of how vaccines have been rolled out, or how medical efficacy has been rolled out, particularly through Africa. And I just wanted you to kind of have the opportunity of commenting on that, because if people do have concerns and a mistrust of government and scientists and so on, whether you'd be able to speak into that at all for me.
Well, absolutely. I think my personal view is that we should all check our sources. Like I said at the start, Rachel, to re-emphasize that a lot of the content you might find even on the government pages or on the World Health Organization channels, some of them are quite hard to understand. And I would say, get someone who understands it to explain it to you, right? If you're not sure. But I think coming to your question, Steve, what we know, there's a question around this vaccine, and I had a few of those to say it was. In fact, I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where there was a perceived view that it was tried in Africa, and so many folks died from it before a modified version of it was used here in the UK or in Western countries. Now, from what I know, I haven't seen any evidence of that, and I'll say people need to be careful with what they read and hear. From the information that's been published so far, and it's all in the public domain. We've got a layman summary version of it for those who cannot handle the deep technical versions of this. There's no evidence of this from what we see. Now, has there been malpractice in the past with how drugs have been developed and how vaccines have been used? Yes, there's no denying that. If we go back to, I think, what's his name? Edward Jenner, the one who is known as the father of vaccines. I think this was in the 1700s, when vaccines were first discovered for smallpox. He took the pox off someone and found an 8-year-old boy and injected it, right? And not on himself or family member. I mean, he injected it on I think one of his workers' child, right? And so this was going back hundreds of years now. And I would say over the years, I've seen the regulations get tighter and tighter. A lot of folks also say that drugs have been experimented in Africa and then used here in the UK. And my response to that would be, the regulators wouldn't accept a drug which hasn't been tried at all in any shape or form in the sample size of its own, or people of similar makeup to that of a particular nation. There are questions. There'll be big questions around that. I think, Steve, what I'll also say is that where there's any form of malpractice, people, the sources you can ring to report those. So obviously, no one can be an expert in every element of drug discovery, vaccine discovery. Yes. Have there been misuse in the past? Yes. Have there been abuse in the past? Yes. Have there been false reporting in clinical trials in the past? Yes, they have. But I believe we're in a better position now than where we were 50 years ago, right? Where drugs went properly, didn't go through a very rigorous process. Does that answer the question?
Really helpful, Ben. I think that gives some context. I'm going to come next onto the issue, and I'm going to come to you, Simon, if possible, of the issue of vaccine passports. I mean, you've had some people talking about this. I don't think, to my knowledge, it's been confirmed that anything like that will happen. But particularly, the government, if they do, or businesses enforce vaccine passports, that makes people really nervous because of the fact that it seems so controlling. So how do we feel about this? And will it ever be the case that people will be restricted from coming to church if they don't have a vaccine, son?
Yeah, great question, Steve. I think that obviously it's still, nobody knows what's going to happen at the moment. Nobody knows what's going to be, where the government's going to go on this. And so it's, in one sense, it's not even helpful to speculate. I think, should it get to the point where people will be told they can't attend large events unless they've been vaccinated, I think there's going to be a huge pushback against that, personally. So I think, yeah, we will deal with that when it comes, if it comes, which I'd be surprised if it does. It might do. I think obviously you've got another line of thought which people don't often think about, is the insurers, and whether people will insure you as a venue if you allow people who haven't been vaccinated, because that's another way.
Yes.
It might be that the government doesn't actually stipulate it, but the insurers have got a huge amount of leverage. If they refuse to insure a venue, you've got major problems with your public liability insurance, and so there's another avenue. So I think there's some huge things that we need to be praying about and thinking about. All I can say for me personally is I will be doing everything to enable everyone who wants to come and worship Jesus. That's what we do as a church, and we'll have to work hard. And I'm in some meetings with government. These issues haven't yet been discussed, and so in the government meetings that I'm in, we'll be discussing these and trying to work out where we go and balance. I don't buy that we've got a Machiavellian government that's seeking to control the population and is seeking, our harm. I just don't buy that line. Are there mixed motives? We've all got mixed motives. Are there things that are confusing? We've all got things that are confusing. But I don't buy the big story that the governments of the world are trying to control the population. I just don't buy that line of thinking. I think everyone is trying to do their best. Is there corruption around the world governments? Obviously, there's no question. But I just don't buy this kind of big kind of global conspiracy to control populations and use this virus and even to the extreme of, it's been manufactured to control the populations of the world. Honestly, I don't see that. And so I think we want to work with the government, and I think they've wanting to work with us to allow people to worship. That's why we responded to the government to not do singing and to not open our doors during these things, because we believe the government's working for our good, and that's, I think, is the leading of Scripture. Obviously, there is a point, and you see this in the Scriptures for Christians to stand against immoral activity from governments. You see it when the Hebrew, back to the Hebrew midwives in Egypt, where they were told to throw the babies into the river, and they refused to do that. So there is a point where Christians do have to stand up and say, no, actually what the government is saying we've got to do here is actually wrong. But I think we're far from that point. Peter and John had a similar situation, didn't they, where they said, who should we obey? We need to obey God rather than man. And so some people are throwing that around already. I think we're way far off that line now. And in some countries, obviously, they are in that situation where they're being told not to meet. And the reason they're being told not to meet is because they're not to promote the gospel. Well, of course, if we get to that point, then we've got a whole situation. But I don't believe we're there in the UK. And I think we're far from it at the moment. We're working with the government. And my aim and our aim is to ensure that everyone can come and worship Jesus who wants to. Obviously, there may be complications and things we need to work through. We'll do our best, as we have right the way through this pandemic, to serve, the church, to serve our people as best we can, and to make things as accessible as we can. So I can't give a definitive answer of where this is all going to go, because nobody actually knows. But I don't know if others want to comment on this and chip in.
Yeah, can I just throw in a few as well? There were similar levels of anxieties when passports were first introduced, right? And the fact that I needed a document to travel, there was a lot of anxiety around that, and that's understandable. That in the middle of a massive level of change, people tend to get worried about what it could mean. I think, like Simon said, we need to look at the motives of this. The truth is that the government already has a lot of records on who's received the vaccine or not received the vaccine. From what I've heard, and I haven't had the vaccine myself, from what I hear, when you go to get your jab, they check in the basic detail, and it's logged onto the system, right? So I don't think having a passport certainly make the government become a lot more aware of who you are and what and try to control you. But I just wanted to land on the point that a lot of this sometimes can be driven by fear, right? And I think as Christians, for those that are Christians, actually, we don't operate from fear. God's not giving us a spirit of fear, but He's giving us a spirit of a sound mind. And
Yes.
I've talking to someone again recently, and they said, hey, what if you get a vaccine and you die, and or what if the government suddenly injects this vaccine through some microchip? And my response was actually, I've got to be with God. It's I don't think we should be so scared and so trapped by fear in life. Of course, that doesn't mean we should accept anything and walk into everything without giving a thought to it. But the motive shouldn't be, the drive shouldn't be fear. When we come into that fear territory, we know we've gone a bit too far. We just need to reset and ask God to give us that spirit of a sound mind again.
That's really helpful. Guys, just as we come in for a land now, I wonder, Enson, I'm going to come to you first, and then Rachel, and then Simon to kind of close. Just whether you had any kind of final thoughts for people. I recognise we've covered so much ground about such a complicated topic this evening, but particularly for you, Enson, whether you had any encouragements for people who are doubting whether they should be having the vaccine or not, or anything else that you feel like the Holy Spirit's just kind of dropping into your heart to just share as we bring ourselves into a land now.
Yeah, sure. So I would. Personally, I would encourage everyone to receive the vaccine, okay? And the reason I'm saying is that, we have witnessed so much suffering in this country and in this town and in this world because of this pandemic, okay? So many people have died, young fit people have died, people with chronic conditions have died, and quite a large number of people are suffering. So we have, I look after, so once the patients improve in the hospital, we tend to discharge them, and we are keeping some of the patients in the community so as to free up beds in the hospital, and we call it the COVID virtual ward. And at any one time, we have approximately 50 patients on our COVID virtual ward. And so quite a large number of these patients who are young patients who are in their 50s or 40s or 50s, they're suffering because they've had severe infections. They have had severe pneumonia. And even after discharge, we are having to keep them on oxygen. We are having to introduce steroids and various other medications to improve their lung function and their lung condition. So, there is so much of suffering, there is so much of morbidity. And, the only way we can reduce this, or only way we can try to reduce this or make an attempt to reduce this, is by having vaccination, okay? So the vaccination may not prevent infection from happening, but certainly we believe that the severe form of the infection, which is a pneumonia and deaths needing admission to hospital and all of those things, we are hoping can be avoided, okay? So I would recommend everyone to have the vaccine. And even in people who have, I think some of the questions asked was in people with chronic fatigue and ME and all of those, group of patients. And the preliminary reports that we have received so far has not shown any significant worsening in their symptoms. Now, what we have to understand is that, yes, once we receive a vaccine, or at least when we receive the second dose of the vaccine, when I've had COVID in March 2020, and when I received the vaccine, I was unwell for 24, 48 hours with fever, body ache, headache, and things like that. But it settled fairly quickly. It just settled, as soon as it appeared, it went away in 24, 48 hours. Now, just imagine, if these patients who have got ME and chronic fatigue, if they were to have the actual COVID infection, just imagine what their suffering would be. Is it better to have some symptoms, milder symptoms, like fever, body ache, headache for 24, 48 hours? Or is it, or compare that with somebody having a COVID infection and ending up in hospital and months of suffering, weeks and months of suffering? It cannot be compared. So I would recommend that anybody with chronic illnesses or whatever, they should go for, vaccination, unless there is some contraindication, which will be made clear to them, depending upon their condition.
It's really helpful, Enson. Thank you. Rachel, I'm going to come to you to see if there's anything that you particularly would like to share as we kind of bring ourselves to a close.
I think just coming back to the fact that I think it's a conscience issue, and I think everyone needs to kind of find their peace on that. That I think coming back to that that place of peace in Jesus, and that I'm hoping that this is helping people navigate that from a place of peace rather than a place of fear. I think just coming back to, we just touched on this area of kind of submission to the leading authorities, and that point that Simon made. And I think alongside that, as Christians, we can engage in activism. If we don't agree with something that the government's doing, or the way that they're doing it, we can submit, but we can make our voices heard. And I think there's a big role for Christians in fighting injustice and making our voices heard if that is a concern with how things progress with some of these things.
Really helpful. Thank you, Rachel. Simon, I'm going to come to you as well for any closing thoughts you might have.
No, I think just to thank our guests for coming on. It's been really informative and interesting. I've learned a lot myself in the discussion. So yeah, thanks for hosting it, Steve, and thanks for all our guests for joining us. It's been fantastic, and thanks for everyone who's been watching and listening. I hope it's been helpful for people, and obviously we can do further discussions on this line if it's needed. Well, listen, I'm gonna leave the final word to Justin Wharton, because there's been many comments that have been coming through right the way through the course of this evening. And I'm so sorry, guys, that there have been some that I haven't been able to address specifically, partly because of the thread and direction we're aiming. But Justin says to us, it's really helpful, sensitive, wise, and engaging discussion. Thank you to all our speakers. And so, listen, on behalf of kind of myself and the entire panel, I do want to say thank you so much for joining us, just as Simon did. And so for our guests this evening, we so appreciate your wisdom, your sensitivity, your helpful responses to each of our questions on a very complicated topic. We do hope it's been helpful, guys. So thank you so much for being with us, and we'll say farewell tonight and have a fantastic weekend. God bless now.